Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular Halacha shir. We're talking about cross-dressing, the Torah prohibition of men wearing women's garments, and the other way around. It doesn't matter which direction you look at it. It's the same from both directions. And what we've learned so far, we've covered so far some of the basic principles governing this prohibition. We've learned, among other things, that if the reason one is wearing a garment of the other sex is in order to protect yourself against the elements, because it's cold and you just need a coat, or it's rainy and you just need a raincoat. If it's clear that the reason you're doing it is to protect yourself against the elements, that's not the prohibition of cross-dressing, because your intention is not at all to look like the other gender. Your intention is to protect yourself against the sun, the rain, whatever it is you're protecting yourself against, and that's fine. And we've seen all the sources for that. We've also seen the sources which speak about cross-dressing in a way which gives a total impression of the other gender, as opposed to just one or two elements taken from the other gender. All of this we've seen in previous shiurim. Today, if I get the sources on the screen, I can usually do this pretty good. Today, we're going to begin dealing with a slightly different issue, but an issue which nonetheless is firmly rooted in this mitzvah. What about things, activities? What about things people do which are not actually clothing, but nonetheless are activities which are associated with the other gender? That's what we're going to talk about today, and we'll see what the opinions of the poskim are about this. First, we begin with the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the great Rav of Volozhin, and the Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin. He wrote as follows: Mishinui Loshna Katuv Tichtiv Kli Gever. When we began with the verses at the beginning of this series, that we saw that the verses spoke about a simla, a garment of a woman, which is prohibited for a man, and we saw that the verses spoke about kli gever, a utensil of a man, which is prohibited for a woman. Well, since the verses use the word simla, a garment, and the word kli, utensil, it therefore follows b'davar hamiyuchad leish, anything which is a utensil, which is uniquely for men, only for men, kamo, for example, klei milchama, for example, weapons. We're talking here about 19th century, right? If we're talking about weapons, only men carry weapons. That's a utensil, which is used only by men. Or some utensil, some object, not an article of clothing, but some other object which is only used by women. Back in the days of the Netziv, in the days of the Netziv in the 19th century, the poskim were very exercised. The great rabbis were very exercised by the question whether a man is allowed to use a handheld fan to cool himself in the hot summer. Maybe a handheld fan is something which only women use. We're not talking about garments here. We're talking about other activities or other implements which are unique to one gender or the other. Or what about some kinds of jewelry to miyuchadin leisha, which only women wear? Back in those days, in the 19th century, only women wore rings. Well, I'm talking about in the neighborhood of the Netziv, right? In Eastern Europe, men did not wear rings. That was a female thing. Now it follows according to the Netziv, that since the verses in the Torah use interchangeably simla, a garment, and kli, a utensil, it follows that even though you're not cross-dressing in the sense of wearing a garment of the other gender, you are carrying an implement of the utensil of the other gender. Over afilu shelo yavo lidei to'eva, you're guilty even if nothing reprehensible happens, even if no one's going to mistake you for the other gender. Well, that's why of all the garments which could be mentioned, the Torah only mentions simla, a dress, a woman's dress, which is a kind of garment that only women wear. Okay, bottom line, it turns out that according to the Netziv, and the reason I quote the Netziv is because he's representative or typical of the mainstream thinking of the poskim. According to this, one is in violation of cross-dressing, not only by wearing garments of the other gender, but even by carrying a single implement or using a single implement, like a handheld fan. In those societies where men don't do that, you're guilty of violating the Torah principle of cross-dressing. Okay, now that's an important idea. If you think about it for a moment, we saw plenty of sources last week, according to which one is in violation of cross-dressing with garments only if it's a complete presentation, not just one article of clothing of the other gender, but a complete presentation. We saw plenty of sources about that last week. As far as carrying an implement, a utensil of the other gender is concerned, a single element, a single utensil, a single implement gets you into trouble in violating this particular mitzvah. Okay, the Netziv, which we just saw on the previous screen, is typical of the mainstream thinking of poskim. But let's see. Okay, let me see if there's something that I can do about. Yeah, I even see that on my screen. That's good. Let's go down to the end of the 20th century by looking at this tshuva of the Be'er Moshe. That's Rav Moshe Stern, originally from Hungary, from the town of Debrecen. The Debrecen Rav ended up in New York after the Holocaust. The question which someone asked him is the following: Yesh b'nei adam ha'halchim l'taken tzipordeihem. Some people go to have their fingernails manicured. Etzel chanut shenashim osot hadavar. And the shop you go to is a place which is frequented by women. Now the question is, can a man get a manicure? Is that something which constitutes a female activity and therefore should be prohibited for men? That's the question. Tshuva, his answer begins as follows: Kishut shel rechitzat panim shelo b'derech rechitza ba'alma asur leish. Women wash their face, men wash their face. As long as they're washing their face in the same way, namely to make their face clean, this is not an imitation of the other gender, and all is well. That's as long as we're talking about washing the face in order to be clean. Lefizeh, it follows, Ma sheyesh anashim hamivasmim atzmam harbe. What about washing the face, not only to get clean, but also to perfume the face? You're using a kind of soap which not only gets you clean, but also perfumes the body. What about that? Well, yotem k'tei laha'avir zuhama. Yeah, well, let's consider different kinds of scents which might be involved, he says. Some scents, some scent which you might be applying to the body would be in order to mask or get rid of zuhama, a bad smell of the body. If all you're trying to do is get rid of a bad smell of the body, that's something men do, that's something women do, that's fine. Oh, but if it's a kind of scent, a kind of smell above and beyond just getting rid of or masking a bad body smell, oh, women perfume themselves, not men, asur. Therefore, this is prohibited for men, mishum bal tilbash. Men are not allowed to perfume themselves beyond using a soap or whatever in order to mask or get rid of bad body smells. Al-Kain, Ra Be'enai, it is therefore evil in my eyes. I think it's really bad. Masha Harbe Anashim Rochatzim Bezayf. I think it's really bad. I mean, it's really bad is not quite the right word. Ra. It's really evil. It's really, you don't want, that's not right, you don't want to be guilty, men do not want to be guilty of using ordinary soap. Ordinary soap for men is really bad. Why is it really bad? Well, it's really bad. Sheyesh lo reach tov ma'od. The ordinary soap which they sell in this country, he's writing this in New York back in the 1970s, the ordinary soap which they sell in this country has a very strong scent to it. And indeed, everyone knows the manufacturers devote an awful lot of time and energy to research and making sure their soaps smell good. That's for women, not for men. That's a scented soap, which accounts for almost all the brands of soap on the market in Europe, North America, and Israel today. Scented soaps are, that's women's activities, therefore prohibited for men. Now, I remember once when I first encountered this approach. When I first encountered this, I was visiting someone in one of the leading Hasidic yeshivas here in Yerushalayim, and while I was waiting, I had to meet someone. I was listening to the mashgiach, the spiritual advisor of the yeshiva, haranguing the boys, and what the subject of the harangue was exactly this issue. He was haranguing the boys not to use any cosmetic products which should be used only by women. In the course of his drasha, I call it a harangue, he would call it a drasha. In the course of his sikha, in the course of what he was saying, the mashgiach, this elderly rabbi, held up his hand, and he says to the talmidim in the yeshiva, "Guckt, take a look at this hand. Die Hand, my hand, soap has never touched my hand." I found that quite amazing. Soap has never touched this hand. And boys, you shouldn't use any soap because they're scented, and that's only for women. Well, according to the text on the screen before us, according to the Be'er Moshe, it's a Torah prohibition for men to use these soaps. He goes on and emphasizes the issue like this. Masha Matir HaRama, it's true that the Rama in the Shulchan Aruch, I don't know if it's correct to call him the co-author of the Shulchan Aruch, but the Rama added the Ashkenaz notes to the Shulchan Aruch. The Rama in the Shulchan Aruch, I'm such a horrible typist. I always imagined that an archaeologist would be able to figure out the order of the keys on the Israeli keyboard by looking at my typographical errors. Of course, I meant Simon and not Dimon, but those are right next to each other on the Israeli keyboard. In any event, it's true that the Shulchan Aruch permits l'histakel b'mara. It's true that the Shulchan Aruch permits men to look in mirrors. It's true. The Shulchan Aruch says if a man looking in a mirror is not guilty of using a woman's implement, as long as he's looking in the mirror in order to make sure that his face is clean. If there's a ketem, some dirt or some stain on his face, and he wants to clean his face, well, he's allowed to look in the mirror in order to clean his face. That's not something that's limited to women. That's okay for men. Well, that's not exactly the same, is it, as looking in the mirror to preen in order to make sure that you're looking very beautiful. Now, of course, someone like me, who is so naturally handsome and has no need to do anything, well, of course, I have no need at all to look in a mirror because I'm just so naturally always handsome and attractive. But according to this, the man who looks in the mirror in order to be able to beautify himself is guilty of cross-dressing, because that is an activity which is limited to women. Bivadai lishtamesh bezayf. Surely, even though the Ramah permitted, even though the Shulchan Aruch permitted men to look in mirrors, using soap, zayf is the Yiddish word for soap, using soap, lahasir ktamim shari v'shari, of course, it's okay to use soap to remove dirt from the body. Of course, it's correct to be clean. Aval, however, halo afshar zeh lahasir im zayf she'ein lo reach chazak. But you can find soap on the market which does not have a strong smell. Like it might not be available in your local store, but there are soaps on the market which are not perfumed, and those are the soaps which men should use. Yishtamesh b'zayf shanashim takan lishtamesh bo. The men should only use those kinds of soap which men use, namely the unscented soaps. She'ein lo reach kal. Well, if there's a slight scent to it, that's okay. Now, of course, I know that many people are even allergic to Some people are even allergic to the substances which are used to perfume soaps. And some people, their allergist or their dermatologist tells them, you use an unscented soap and your skin will be a lot healthier. But according to our author, the halacha is that since only women are using the scented soaps, men must refrain. Yeah. Now, the Knesset HaGedolah, these are still the words of the Be'er Moshe. He's quoting the Knesset HaGedolah. Rabbi Ben-Vnisty was his name, one of the great early poskim. He points out that according to the Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim in medieval Spain, the prohibition of men looking in a mirror was already well established back in the Middle Ages, back in the days of the Rishonim. Kol shekain, all the more so, should it be prohibited today for men to use soap which has a strong smell, the kind of soap which women use. Now, of course, from his point of view, living within the confines of the society within which he lived, this absolutely blocks men within that social group from using perfumed soap, scented soaps. Now, today, if you can, in your fantasy, imagine a society in which men, the ordinary soaps which men are using, are also scented, and men and women are using the same soap. If you can imagine in your fantasy such a society, then of course, as we've seen in the past, we've seen quite a number of proofs in the past that the prohibition of cross-dressing depends upon social standards in the society, in the place and time where you happen to find yourself. And of course, these standards vary over the course of time, and these standards, what is normal in one society is not necessarily normal in another society. These standards vary even from neighborhood to neighborhood, depending upon the social circles in which you find yourself. And we've seen plenty of examples where this mitzvah, this prohibition of the Torah, unlike most commandments of the Torah, most commandments of the Torah are absolute and do not depend upon the social standards. This one does depend upon what is acceptable. Now, even today, when it's become quite common, at least in my neighborhood, it's become quite common for men to use scented soaps. Even in my neighborhood, I don't know about your neighborhood, but even in my neighborhood, there still are soaps which are scented specifically for women, and only women use those scents. Well, if that's true in your society, as it is in my neighborhood, then those soaps are for women, and usually that's what it says clearly on the label, because that's the kind of scent which women like to use, and which in fact, in practice, men are not using. And if that's the fact, that men are not using it, well, then it's prohibited for men, and that's all there is to it. Let's go one step further. This tshuva was written, as I said, by Rav Moshe Stern, the Debrecen Rav in New York. He was one of the great Hasidic rabbis. We're going to look now at the Oz Nidburu. Oz Nidburu was written by Rav Binyamin Zilber. Rav Binyamin Zilber was generally called Binyamin HaTzadik. The reason people called him that was because that's what the Chazon Ish called him. He was a disciple of the Chazon Ish, and he was one of the leading disciples of the Chazon Ish. Rav Binyamin HaTzadik, Rav Binyamin Zilber, as he grew to maturity, became one of the leading poskim, one of the leading rabbis in Eretz Yisrael, but he's in the other camp, not in the Hasidic camp, he's in the Misnagdic camp. Let's see what he has to say on this issue. Mutar le'ish l'hitrachetz b'sabon zayif sheyesh lo reach shena'aseh be'ikar l'nekayon. As long as the soap is made primarily, first and foremost, to get clean, men are allowed to use it, even though it has a secondary function of perfuming the body. That's what he wrote. Now, when he wrote that, some people objected, and they said to him, what about the opinion of the Be'er Moshe, which we just saw on the previous screen? And he responded, Yedidi, my dear friend, Rav Moshe Stern, it should say, Rav Moshe Stern Shlita, in his book, and we just saw the tshuva of Rav Moshe Stern on the previous two screens, he wrote, Mistama b'sabon sheyesh l'reach hazak ma'od asur. Rav Moshe Stern wrote that men are prohibited from using soaps with a strong smell. Gamani modesh asur. He's right. Rav Moshe Stern is right, and I agree with him. If it's a strong smell, men shouldn't use it. And his insight is the insight of a very wise rabbi, prohibiting strongly scented soaps for men. Very wise insight, and the acuity, the precision, the insight of a wise man is even greater than the understanding and perception of a prophet. The wise Rav Moshe Stern said, "Milifnei kama chodashim," he was very wise in what he said because of what happened in my household. Rav Binyamin Zilber said. Rav Binyamin Zilber lived here in Yerushalayim. In my household, A few months ago, Huvalveti, someone brought into my household sabon, soap, sheyesh lo reich hazak מאוד, with very strong smell. And I was very surprised that someone bought that soap and brought it into my household. בהחלט שאין לאנשים להתרחץ בסבון כזה. Of course, men should not use a soap like that. I'd never smelled a soap like that. But when someone bought it and brought it into my household, I realized what Rav Moshe Stern is talking about. That's a female. That's a woman's soap. V'im lokech sabon kazeh, if a man would take a soap like that, gilad da'ato, he is revealing his intention. A man who uses a strongly scented soap is revealing his intention. She'eno mechaven rak lemikayon. He's revealing his intention that he doesn't care only about getting clean. Rak liyapot etatzmo. It's clear that he's doing it in order to beautify himself, in order to make himself smell better. And that's something women do. Lachein asur, therefore prohibited. Al kol panim, yesh lachmir lakol, and of course everyone should be strict about this, aval lechaverim. But if we're talking about our people, in our society, if we're talking about yeshiva people, in the yeshiva society, that's the society he came from. If we're talking about yeshiva people in yeshiva society, asur behechlet. No man should use these soaps, but if we're talking about a yeshiva person, well, absolutely prohibited, just like Reb Moshe Stern wrote on the previous screens. Okay, now what we've seen is that if you live in a society, you don't have to live in a society if you are at the moment located in a society. After all, you can travel from one country to another, and at the moment you're in a different society. If in the standards of the society in which you find yourself at the moment, such and such is used by men, then women are prohibited from using it. If in the society in which you find yourself at the moment, such and such is used only by women, and men are blocked from using it. That's the whole point, and one should not allow oneself to get too hung up on the specific examples, like scented soap or mirrors or whatever, because the specific examples are likely to shift, are likely to change from one society to another, surely over the course of time, and even from one neighborhood to another. Now, this, of course, opens the question about exactly how these changes can take place. Are there rules governing acceptable methods for changing what is standard, what is acceptable? Are there rules? How do we determine when a change has occurred, and therefore the halacha has to change accordingly? As I've emphasized before, not all halacha, in fact, most halacha does not change according to social circumstances, but this one does. And therefore, we're going to need some rules in order to establish what constitutes a valid change in the usage of men and women within a given society. Well, let's see how these things can change in the course of time. We begin with the tour, very end of the Middle Ages, very end of the Rishonim, but I choose his opinion to present because it's typical, more or less standard of the mainstream view of the Rishonim. He quotes the Rambam, who says, "Lo asru ha'avarat se'ar." Removal of body hair is only prohibited, is prohibited for men. Men are prohibited from removing body hair only in a place where women are the only people who remove hair from that part of the body. Oh, So apparently, back in the Middle Ages, if you were very interested in personal hygiene, back in the Middle Ages, here you have a little window to what they were doing. Women removed bodily hair from certain parts of the body. Men did not. And therefore, men are not allowed to do that. The the Baal HaTurim, which is mentioned in chat, is indeed by the same author, but it's not a halachic work. It's a very, very, I don't know if clever is the right word. Yes, clever. It's a very, very clever commentary on the Torah, and if you are pressed for a public presentation, of something having to do with a weekly parsha, you'll find very clever things in the Baal HaTurim. He was extraordinarily sharp. So, in any event, what have we seen? Men cannot remove bodily hair, which only women in your society remove. Now, in the commentaries on the Torah, led by the Prisha, Rabbi Falk was his name, Nira de Ratzaloma Anashim Goyim. How do we determine what is normal in a society? Do we look only at what the Jews are doing? No, the Prisha says, and this is a mainstream view of the poskim. In order to determine what is normal in a given society, what is normal for men to do or what is normal for women to do, you don't look only at the Jews. You also look at the non-Jews, amongst whom the Jews are living. When we're talking about what is normal, what is standard activity for men or for women in a given place and time, we're talking about the population in general, including non-Jews. Kevan, the nahug, nahug. Whatever the practice of that society is, that's it. And if we're talking about the prohibition of cross-dressing, everyone has to conform. Lamdinan, we learn the minhag hagoyim. The way goyim behave has great influence over this particular prohibition, and therefore we must consider what they do as well, what they don't do, what men or women do or don't do, even among the non-Jews. And when we're talking about determining the correct activities for men and women, the correct utensils, the correct things for them to do, if all of the men change their practice, if all of the men change their practice, or if all of the women change their practice together, if they all change together, well, if that happens, ein mochin bi'adam. There's no need to object. And since they've all changed together, presto zippo, the halacha changes accordingly, and whatever was previously permitted now becomes prohibited because now men no longer do that, or men and women no longer do that, or the other way around. All of a sudden what was prohibited becomes permitted if now all of a sudden all the men are doing it or all the women are doing it. Now, you'll notice that in order for this to work, he requires all of the people to change. In order for a change to be acceptable, it's not enough that individuals change. That's not enough to say the standards of society have changed. You need everyone to change. Now, of course, everyone knows that in halacha, whenever the poskim speak about kol, all of, whether it's all of people or all of animals or all of whatever it is, of course, everyone knows that the rule of majority is what rules in halacha, and therefore, although the word kulam does sound like it means 100% of the population, that's not, halachically speaking, that's not what's required. What you need is the majority of the population in order to have the halachic status of all. Now, according to this, we're left with the following conclusion, and this is the mainstream of thinking of the poskim. The conclusion is as follows. When change begins, within society, there are two possibilities. One possibility is everyone can change together. That doesn't happen very often, I suppose. The other possibility is, I suppose, far more common. There's a pioneer, a first woman who changes her practice, or a first man who changes his practices, and then there's a second, and there's a third, and either the change introduced by the pioneers will catch on and be embraced by everyone else and will become common. What do I mean common? The majority of people are going to be doing it, or the change embraced by the pioneers is going to be rejected by the majority. Now, during this transition period, when a majority of the people have not yet changed, I'll give you a specific example, and you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Imagine that in the previous generation, men did not wear rings. Only women wore rings. Well, that's true in the previous generation. Now things began to change, and all of a sudden, some men are wearing wedding bands. All of a sudden, it's changing. Well, while the change is in progress, and the number of men who are wearing wedding bands is still a minority of the population, and some pious Jewish man is getting married, and he goes to the rabbi, and he asks the rabbi, "Can I also wear a wedding band? Can I also wear?" The rabbi will look around and he says, no, the majority have not yet embraced this change. No, you should not wear a wedding band. Oh, but of course, not everyone asks the rabbi. Some people, like the pioneers here, changed, started wearing wedding bands, even though if they had asked the rabbi would have told them not to do it. But they didn't ask, they just changed. In the course of time, more and more people changed. Now imagine a society in which the next generation, it's common. Majority of the men wear wedding bands. Perhaps you know a society like that somewhere in the world. Well, as soon as a majority of the people, a majority of the men are wearing wedding bands, now a pious Jew comes and asks the rabbi, "Rabbi, can I also wear a wedding band?" Now the rabbi looks around and says, "Yeah, a majority of the men are doing it. You too can do it if you wish." Oh, the halacha changes only after there were some pioneers who did what they did without rabbinic consultation, and had they asked the rabbis would have said, "No, don't change," but they didn't ask. They did not consult with rabbis. They just went ahead and did it. The new practice became widespread, and at such time as the new practice became widespread, then the rabbis could give their approval to it. Now, this is a terribly important idea, and should be borne in mind in many, many contexts. I know there are many areas out there where individuals are seeking rabbinic approval for various changes they would like to introduce in Jewish society. Just think about the position of women in Jewish society, or many other issues. There are people out there who would like to see changes, and these people are often seeking a rabbinic seal of approval, looking for a rabbi who will approve of this change or that change, which they wish to introduce into the structure of Jewish society. Well, according to the Prisha on the screen, and this is representative of the mainstream thinking of the poskim, it doesn't work that way. You cannot expect the rabbis on top to impose changes on the structure of society below. The change has to come not from the rabbis, the change has to come from the people. If it's the people who have changed, then the rabbis can give their seal of approval. But the change is not instituted from above; it grows from the people, from the grassroots. It follows, therefore, that someone who has introduced a change into the structures, that he was the first man or the second man or the third man to wear a wedding band in his neighborhood, in his town, well, the rabbis frowned on that. But they did it anyway. They did it anyway. They thought it was cool. They did it anyway, even though the rabbis were frowning. In the course of time, a lot of men found it cool. And a lot of men are now wearing wedding bands. I mean, a majority of them are doing it. Now the rabbis can smile on this. Now, of course, as I've emphasized many times, not all, in fact, most halacha does not change. Most halacha is immutable, but this particular halacha, and there are other examples of halachas which change according to social standards, that's the way it works. Let's go one step further. Before we consider shaving, that's what we're speaking about here, removal of body hair. Consider another specific example, and you'll see how things go. Back in the good old days, in the Middle Ages, and in early modernity, Middle Ages, early modernity, and truly in ancient times, weapons, as we've already mentioned, weapons were carried by men, and only by men. Indeed, wearing a sword, for example, in the Middle Ages, or even in early modern times, wearing a sword was an accoutrement, a utensil, an implement worn exclusively by men. And of course, men would wear the sword, even if they had not the slightest intention of ever using it, even if they didn't know how to use it, even if the sword they were carrying was not very useful, it was purely decorative. It's part of the male attire to have a sword. Well, in those times, of course, in those times and places, of course, women are not allowed to wear swords because it's a male garment, a male utensil, a male implement. It is the founding of the State of Israel, even before the founding of the State of Israel, when the progenitors of the Israeli army, the Haganah, the Palmach, and the others were organizing armed forces to defend the Jewish population in Eretz Israel. Of course, the question arose: are women allowed to join the armed forces? That's a complicated way of saying, are women allowed to carry rifles and pistols? If you're in a place and time where only men wear swords, then it's prohibited for women. If you are in a place and time where the practice has changed, and we've discussed how these changes occur, and women in fact are carrying weapons, then all of a sudden it becomes permissible. That's how it works. Now, let's focus again on the question of removal of body hair. The Gra, the Gaon Mevilna, 18th century, worth at least 20 points in any discussion of halacha, says as follows: Kol mekamot hazakan shelo b'makom hapeot mutar af betar. The idea is as follows. Everyone knows that the Torah prohibits men from shaving. That's a Torah prohibition. Now, the Torah prohibition for men to shave is formulated with the idea of a razor. The men are not allowed to use a razor on their faces. Now, it follows, therefore, the Gemara figures out very quickly that it's the razor which is prohibited for use on the man's face. It follows, therefore, that the scissors are okay. The Torah only prohibits razors. It follows that scissors are okay. Scissors, back in the old days, were called a zug, a pair of blades. Now, what's the conceptual difference between a razor and scissors? Well, anyone who's used a razor, anyone who's used scissors knows that a razor is a single blade which is sharp enough to cut. In this case, we're talking about cutting hair. A razor can cut other things also. But a razor is a single sharp blade which is sharp enough to cut hair. We're talking about hair at the moment. Scissors, on the other hand, of course, consist of two blades. That's why they used to call it a zug, a pair of blades. And in the pair of blades in scissors, neither blade by itself is sharp enough to cut anything. You surely can't cut a hair with one of the blades of a scissors. It's only the action of both blades together, crushing the hair between the two blades. That's what cuts the hair. But without both blades working together to crush the hair is not going to be cut with a single blade of scissors. So scissors, where the blades are, neither blade is sharp enough to cut, that's called scissors, and that's permitted for the beard. Ta'ar, razor, which is sharp enough to cut by itself, that's what the Torah prohibited. Now, of course, this opens the question of the modern electric shaver for men. Razors are prohibited for the beard for men. That's simple. That's what the Torah says. But as far as electric shavers are concerned, I don't know all the models of electric shaver in the world, but all the models I have seen work with scissor. All the models I have seen work with scissor action. That is, the hair gets caught between a reshet, between a screen, and a rotating blade crushes the hair, which is caught in the screen. That's scissor action. Now, I cannot speak about all of the models that exist in the world, but it's easy enough to check any specific model to see whether or not the blades are sharp enough to cut by themselves, and if so, the electric shaver is prohibited for men. Easy enough to tell, because the shaving head opens up on every model of electric shaver, so you can clean the blades inside. Just remove one of the rotating blades, hold one of the rotating blades in one hand, and see whether or not it's sharp enough to cut a hair on some other part of the body, not on the face. There's no prohibition to cut hair on other parts of the body. I would be surprised. I could be surprised, but I would be surprised if you find a model of electric shaver where the blades by themselves are sharp enough to cut hair without the reshet, without the screen being used together with it. The reason I would be surprised is because I don't understand exactly why anyone would design an electric shaver which depends upon the sharpness of the blade. After all, an electric shaver which depends upon the sharpness of the blade will get dull after a few weeks, and you would need to resharpen the blades every week regularly. I don't know why anyone would design an electric shaver like that, but maybe there is such out there. I really don't know, but it's easy enough to check any specific electric razor if the blades are sharp enough, and I'd be surprised if there is such. If the blades are sharp enough to cut a hair by themselves, that electric shaver is prohibited for men. Otherwise, it's permitted, and that's all there is to it. Okay, now according to the Gra takes one step further. Scissors are okay, razor is prohibited. Now he goes one step further. But a man who removes his facial hair in order to beautify himself. You see, I'm of course so handsome and attractive that my beard, such as it is a great element of my appearance. But a man who removes his facial hair in order to look better, asur. That's prohibited. Mishum bal tilbash, because removing facial hair, that's something that women do. Women have no beards, men do, therefore permitted for women to remove facial hair, prohibited for men. That's a female activity. Men are prohibited from removing hair, even with scissor action, even with electric shavers, because it's an imitation of a female activity, and therefore, according to the Gra, prohibited. Now this idea is not only an idea of the Gra. We find the same idea in the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek I was confused, I think he was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. He's one of the early Lubavitcher Rebbes. He's a grandson of the Baal Tanya, making like a third generation. I guess he was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. And of course, not only in Chabad, but in Hasidic circles in general, the opinion of Tzemach Tzedek is highly revered. He says as follows: Yesh begiluach hazakan mishum alav de lo yilbash gever. Men removing facial hair is prohibited because of cross-dressing, even if it's done in a way which is not a violation of shaving the beard, even if it's done with scissor action and not razor action. It's still prohibited because it's an imitation of women. Removing facial hair is more of an imitation of women than removing hair from the armpit or genital hair, pubic hair. After all, women also remove hair from armpits and pubic hair. Men doing that are also in violation, but facial hair is even worse because it's more visible. Therefore, even though you're using scissor action, prohibited to remove facial hair. Doesn't matter how you remove facial hair, prohibited. Now, this is the opinion of the Gra, which we just saw on the previous screen, the leader of the anti-Hasidic forces. This is the opinion of the Tzemach Tzedek, one of the leaders of the Hasidic forces, and therefore, in Eastern Europe, this was, back in those days, the standard view. Now, of course, this raises the question, is this a halacha which can change in the course of time from one society to another? Are we required to follow the social standards of 18th century Eastern Europe, or can we change our practices to be in accord with the standards of the society in which we find ourselves? Rav Moshe Feinstein, in Igros Moshe, wrote as follows: Misvarat Tzemach Tzedek, another misspelling, the mem and tzadi are right next to each other on the Hebrew keyboard. And of course I meant Tzemach Tzedek. According to the idea of the Tzemach Tzedek, Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote, 20th century New York, Ra'aya, there's a proof, according to him, there's a proof, Sha'isur al manat sheyeh mekushat kenashim te'im lokein, lo haya makom klal, so to sport zakan. According to his proofs, men are prohibited from removing facial hair because that's something women do. Minei, from him, nishma, we hear, T'masha cholkim alav, hu metam delo nechshav b'tikunei noshin. The only way to object to the opinion of the Tzemach Tzedek, the only way to reject it is to claim that removing facial hair is not a female activity. The Gam believes that. But maybe there's another issue here, Rav Moshe Feinstein suggests. Women, Rav Moshe Feinstein points out, women do not have beards. That's the way they were created. Women, in general, have no need to shave, no reason to shave, to remove facial hair. Women, in general, have no facial hair, and therefore, shaving is not a female activity. Shaving the face is not a female activity. That's not something women do, and therefore, a man doing it cannot be called imitating a female activity. This is an activity which women don't do. Women do not shave their faces. Uh, what makes this a female activity? He asks. אם כי איני ראוי לחלוק על הגאון את צמח צדק, even though I am not fit to propose an argument, although I am not fit to disagree with the great rabbi, the Tzemach Tzedek, Makom Makom, nonetheless, I'm going to do it. Roseh Ani, I want to Mulamed Zchut, I want to explain why the men in New York who are shaving with electric razors, al makilim, why they're lenient and why they're justified in being lenient, why it's correct for them to do it. Removing facial hair has nothing to do with removing hair from the armpits or pubic hair. In our society, he's talking about New York, he wrote this back in the 1950s. In New York, women remove hair from the armpits, men don't do that, and therefore men are blocked from shaving in the armpits. Unlike shaving the face, women don't shave their faces, and therefore a man shaving the face is not engaged in an activity which imitates women. For these reasons, in addition to these reasons, we have to add one more reason for leniency. In addition to the above reasons for leniency, namely removing facial hair is not an activity that all the women are doing. There are some women who do it, but it's not not all of them, most of them not. In addition to this reason, we live in a place and time, New York, 1950s, we live in a place and time where all the men are clean shaven. Even if we don't count into our population count non-religious Jews, even if we look only at the Torah observant Jews and the non-Jews, we know we have to count the non-Jews as well. We saw that. Almost all the non-Jewish men are clean shaven. That's a vast majority of the population in our society here in New York. And we already saw what the Drisha wrote a few screens ago, that we do count the non-Jews, and therefore the standards of society have changed, and therefore the halacha must change accordingly, and therefore, of course, men can use kosher means to remove facial hair. Kosher means scissor action and not razor action, and that's most, perhaps all, electric shavers. He ends with the words, Hamachmir, Tavo alav birkat Agon HaKadosh, any man who is strict and refrains from removing facial hair, the blessing of the great Rabbi Tzemach Tzedek, the leader of Chabad, shall fall upon him, and he will be blessed. Of course, he's sympathetic with men having beards, but as far as halacha is concerned, it's not required. Now, with this, we come to the end of our series of shiurim on cross-dressing. In Elul, when the WebYeshiva begins again, I'm going to be giving a number of classes. One, a series on the question whether or not women are permitted to enter the sukkah. I hope you find this question to be a bizarre one, but the answer to the question turns out to be fairly complicated, and the answer to the question turns out to illuminate many of the fundamental concepts of the mitzvah of sukkah, and we'll be dealing with that in Elul. In addition, I'll be giving a series of shiurim on grafted etrogim, etrog murkav, which etrogim are kosher and which are invalid. And I also will be giving a series of shiurim on showering, bathing the body, showering on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Tov, not on Shabbat, but on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Tov. We'll discuss exactly what is permitted and prohibited as far as showering is concerned. Until then, I wish you a good week and a good summer and a Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you all again when the Web Yeshiva commences in Elul. Until then, Shalom, Shalom.